Like a comet blazing across the evening sky, gone too soon.
Chapter 22. Gone Too Soon. I was out near Pasadena, the city at the foot of the San Bernardino Mountains, at a business meeting with people from China, when a good friend, CNN host Larry King, called my wife's cell phone to ask if we knew anything about a TMZ report saying Michael has been rushed into UCLA hospital. I wasn't immediately alarmed because it was hardly the first time the media had got excited about my brother being rushed to hospital. But then I called Mother and caught her hurrying out of the door at Havenhurst. As soon as I heard her voice, I knew something was very wrong. She sounded fraught with anxiety. "Jermaine, I'm rushing down now. I'll call you when I get there. Leave now," she said. Halima and I jumped in the car, not knowing what to think for the next hour or so, as I sat in the passenger seat and she fought traffic, waiting for Mother or someone to call back. En route, Attorney Joe Katz called. "Jermaine, I hear it's really, really bad." But he knew little else. Details were scant, it seemed, and I couldn't bring myself to turn on the radio and listen to the media grapevine. Halima was driving like she owned the highway, and I'm glad she was, because I would have been incapable behind the wheel. I felt physically sick and I was trembling, which, looking back, was probably my body's way of bracing me. Janet called from New York, and she was losing it too. I don't even remember what was said, but we seemed to be talking only to hold on to one another. No sooner had I ended that call than the phone rang again. Mother's number flashed up. The only time in my life that I didn't want to take a call when her name illuminated the screen. "Mother?" "He's dead!" I don't know what has haunted me most about that moment. Hearing the hardest news, or the sound of Mother's pain. A guttural wail that I can't describe. I started yelling, "He's dead! Michael is dead!" "He's dead." Softer now. A note from the reader: this is very hard for me to get through, so please bear that in mind. Halima was crying. I was crying. And the rest of the journey to the hospital was a blur. I remember seeing about 12 news helicopters in the sky, circling the same spot. The surrounding streets in Westwood were taped off, and the crowds were growing, all walking in the same direction. When a policeman spotted us, he waved us through, and Halima dropped me by an alleyway that led to the hospital's side door as she went to park. Half running, half walking, I hurried inside, down corridors and through double doors. "Where is she? Where is my mother?" I called to a nurse. She showed me into a conference room. Inside, Mother was alone, just sitting there in the silence, at the far end of the table, wearing her dark glasses, not crying, just staring into space. There was no possibility of denial now. I walked over, knelt beside her, and hugged her as tight as I could. She was rigid. I kept holding her. We both needed comforting. Until my cousin Trent walked in, allowing me to leave her in his strong company. All I could think about now was getting to Michael. Outside in the corridor, Latoya rushed past, and then Randy, looking shell-shocked. "Somebody did this," he kept saying. "Somebody did this." That comment didn't really register. I wasn't capable of listening. Randy showed me the way to the room where our brother lay, pointing to a door that he clearly didn't want to walk through a second time. It was like a sitting room, with a lamp and a sofa, but a window looked into a room within the room. Latoya was already there, standing alone, leaning down into Michael's face, like she was talking to him. He was lying on a trolley in a hospital gown. Momentarily, I felt like an observer, looking through that window, as if being on the outside somehow didn't make it real. But then Latoya looked up, tears streaming down her face. I steadied myself, took a breath, and entered the side door to the right. I went over to the other side of Michael, reaching out to take his hand, rubbing his still soft skin, like you do when you comfort someone. I couldn't believe how skeletal he was. He seemed half the size he had been a month earlier. If a stranger had walked into the room, they would have assumed he had been ravaged by cancer or anorexia. Or, as one of the paramedics would later say, that he had been a hospice patient. "What's happened to you?" I knew no amount of rigorous dancing could have left him in this state. Grief didn't allow me to process the impossibility of how he looked. I was still coming to terms with seeing him lifeless. I leaned down and kissed him on the forehead, telling him I loved him. I found I couldn't pull away. I lifted one of his eyelids because I wanted to look into his eyes, see him one last time. "Look at me, Michael. Look at me." I rested my forehead against his and wept. I did this despite the Islamic teachings that told me I was looking into a shell whose spirit had already flown. A spirit that was probably looking down on me, telling me not to cry, telling me he was okay. I remembered how we both said we like stepping out of our bodies to observe and critique ourselves. That was what I thought he was doing now, watching over us. Oh boy. Prince, Paris, and Blanket walked in with a nurse. What they said and did deserves to remain private, between them and their father. But the moment I saw those kids crumple, I had to get out of there and leave them with their auntie. I wasn't strong enough for them, and I could feel my legs giving way. People describe grief as a physical pain, but I didn't know how wrong they were until that day. It's not a wound that can be stitched, and there is no surgeon who can heal it. It's an emotional pain. It's a resident pain that just moves in, and you have to look at and sit with it every day for the rest of your life. And for us, we'd have Michael's fans look at us and measure our grief to see if we were grieving enough for the grief they felt. Because, beyond those hospital walls, an entire world of fans, the millions of strangers he referred to as his second family, were inconsolable too. Outside in the corridor, I saw a cast of suits standing around. AEG CEO Randy Phillips, Frank DeLeo, the manager fired long ago by Michael but rehired by AEG, and Tommy, also recently fired by my brother. But I didn't have a chance to focus on them. Someone walked over to me and said they wanted me to read a press statement that confirmed Michael's death. Of course, I said. His fans need to know. We just have to find a room without a window, because there's so many fans out there that if you go out front, there'd be a crush against the glass, I was told. Some fans have wondered why I made the announcement and not a doctor. All I can say is that it was the idea of the attorneys and the medical staff. And it felt right to me that someone with a personal connection to Michael should do it. Let the fan community hear it from family first. I stood in a back room, waiting to walk on, going over lines written for me. Just reading them once to myself left me short of breath. I couldn't process the script. He was ready to make his comeback and prove everyone wrong. He can't be dead. This can't have happened. How can... They're ready for you now, Jermaine, someone shouted. I walked in, greeted by the flutter of cameras, as I stood before a cluster of microphones and spotlights. I took a deep breath and started.
This is hard. My brother, the legendary king of pop, Michael Jackson, passed away on Thursday, June 25th, 2009 at 2:26 p.m. It is believed he suffered cardiac arrest in his home. However, the cause of his death is unknown until results of the autopsy are known. His personal physician, who was with him at the time, attempted to resuscitate my brother. And as did the paramedics who transported him to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. Upon arriving, a team of doctors attempted to resuscitate him, and they were unsuccessful.
We would later come to understand the futility of these attempts, because Michael had been dead before anyone dialed 911. It was around 12:05 p.m. when he had apparently stopped breathing in his bedroom. And, it seems, 12:21 p.m. before an emergency call was placed. After the press conference, I walked back to the room where Mother was. Joseph was on his way from Vegas. She hadn't moved from her seat, but she responded as I walked in this time. "Hi, baby, you okay?" she asked, reverting to the mother's role, making sure everyone else was alright. We were sitting there, holding hands, and she told me how she had prayed all the way to the hospital for Michael to be alive. Tears rolled down her face as she relived that hope with me. Our conversation was interrupted when a tall black guy walked into the room, wearing a heavy face. Security, I told myself. He sat down, looking uncomfortable. Everything about him was awkward. He was across the table from me and sitting side on to Mother. It dawned on me that this was Dr. Conrad Murray, my brother's personal physician. He said he wanted to express his condolences. He had travelled in the back of the ambulance and had broken the news to Mother when she arrived. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jackson, but he's gone." I would later learn that he had been in my brother's life long before this is it was ever planned. Apparently he had been called out for the first time in Vegas to treat Paris for something, and Michael had retained him soon afterwards. At Michael's request, he was hired by AEG for the tour. I don't know what, if any, checks they made in regards to his suitability, but by having him on their payroll, they were, in my opinion, responsible for his duty of care to their artists. The house where Michael died was on Cowwood Drive, Holmby Hills, a neighborhood next to Beverly Hills. It was a mansion that AEG had rented for him and his children while he was in rehearsal. The previous month he had stayed at the Bel Air Hotel. I couldn't face going there after his death. None of the brothers could. In our numbed state, we came together at my house and comforted one another. Meanwhile, Mother, Janet, and Latoya felt the need to be there. In fact, Latoya's boyfriend, Jeffrey Phillips, stayed there overnight by himself for 2 weeks, presumably to guard against vultures. Around July, it would become clear that the house was a no-go zone for anyone, because it had become a crime scene. The LAPD elevated its accidental death inquiries into a homicide investigation. The autopsy report ruled that Michael had had a healthy heart and had died from acute propofol intoxication, with no other factor related to the immediate cause of death. The media would go on to portray him falsely as a junkie, trying to make the link with prescription drug usage. But that, and drugs like Demerol, were not the reason why his heart stopped. What was clear was that the anesthetic propofol was everywhere in his system. I didn't even know what propofol was, but I've since learned that it is not a recreational drug, and it was not prescription medicine. Propofol is what people are given intravenously as an anesthetic before major surgery, or doctors use it for sedation. This, I would find out, is what Michael relied on to be knocked out when desperate for sleep. According to the instructions, it should be given only by a trained anesthetist, and the patient's intake must be carefully monitored with the appropriate medical equipment in place. Michael was usually beset by sleeping problems only on tour, so it was, to the best of my knowledge, a departure for him to be using this kind of sleep inducer during rehearsals. It's also worth noting that the last time Michael would have needed something like propofol would have been during his last tour, History, in 1997. It didn't surprise me that his insomnia was returning in the run-up to his London dates, because of the unimaginable pressure to which he was subjected, most of it self-imposed. He was his own biggest rival in the relentless drive to be perfect within the great comeback he'd envisaged. Pressure. It would become a theme in everything I went on to discover about the final days of his life. We, as a family, would face a struggle in our pursuit of the facts. Understandably, the LAPD had its investigation to conduct, and Dr. Conrad Murray's actions would be central to its inquiries. But I didn't expect to run into a wall when I wanted to know what really happened during rehearsals for This Is It. We needed to understand how, from May 14th, when we had last seen him, Michael could lose his life and all that weight so rapidly. He had gone from 100 to 155 pounds to what his autopsy report said was 136 pounds. That is not only abnormal, it's frightening. For a man of his height, 5'9", it was thinner than anorexic thin. Many fans, understandably passionate to know the truth, have criticised us for not banging the drum loud enough for justice. But it has taken 2 years of quiet work to establish a mere outline of events. What I shall share with you next is what I have discovered. It has made me understand that the movie This Is It, showing Michael in rehearsals, was not the whole picture. Like everything else in his life, it was just another clever edit. That footage might have provided a glimpse of what could have exploded on stage in London. And I know it can be argued it's a great film that portrayed who Michael was as an artist. But that well-chosen footage didn't show the truth of what went on in rehearsals. That was a whole other disturbing story. By the start of June, rehearsals were taking place at the Forum in Inglewood, and Michael was apparently still focused and businesslike. Everything was going wonderfully well. Some people who saw him dance said he wasn't on fire, but he had always held back, reserving his 100% for the concerts. That was why no one saw any electric moves or signature magic. Anyone who truly knew his method would have known this was his normal half speed. By now, 4 opening tour dates had been pushed back, and there was speculation that the reason was health related. But the truth, which didn't please my brother, was that pre-show rehearsals in London had been booked in error at Wembley Arena. No artist was going to perform without rehearsals at the actual venue, so the dates had to be moved to build in essential rehearsal time at the O2. Outwardly, and apart from the insomnia that was creeping in and getting him down as usual, there was no alarm about his health at this stage, even if some people around him were worrying about how loaded the schedule was getting. In fact, Michael had told his friends that he was going to have a word and change things, so those concerns had been heard. One potential problem with Michael was that only a handful of people were recently used to working with him, and I suspect there was little familiarity with his character in particular ways. This probably had something to do with the fact that AEG seemed intent on bringing in some of its own people. Director Kenny Ortega hadn't worked with my brother in a long time. Musical director Michael Bearden was chosen over Michael's preferred Greg Fillinganes, and choreographer Travis Payne, who last worked with Michael during Dangerous, was left in charge when my brother's preferred choice of Lavelle Smith Jr. was dismissed. Meanwhile, I don't think AEG's CEO Randy Phillips could have had any idea who or what he was dealing with except Michael Jackson, in quotes. Outside of the dressing room personnel, there was a sense of starting from scratch, instead of trusting proven practices from the history tour. This was important. To get the most from Michael, and to alleviate at least some of the pressure he put on himself, he had always needed to feel comfortable with the setup around him. He needed people who understood him and how he worked. On This Is It, I'm not sure he felt that on every level, especially with some of the art direction, costume choices, and the musical mixes coming back in his ears. As he confided in someone close to him after rehearsals, "Wait until we get to London. I'm changing everything. We're going to do things my way." Michael's strategy was to honour the 10 dates he'd agreed to, and then he was going to renegotiate the contract based on the 40 dates he hadn't approved, knowing that public demand and the headlines would be behind him. That was what he told people he trusted, and that was also why he seemed strangely indifferent in meetings to discuss the concerts. He was biding his time. I also know that Michael was not happy when AEG brought in his old manager Frank DeLeo, and then, a week before his death, when his ex-attorney John Branca arrived on the scene, and would later become an executor of Michael's estate, together with our old school friend John McClane. Michael had dismissed them, yet AEG clearly felt that it needed familiar faces whose experience could build a wall around him to protect him, as one person involved with AEG put it. I think there was a sense that Michael needed handling, so AEG turned to those with historic, if not recent, knowledge of him. The move seemed more about bringing peace of mind to the promoter than to Michael. John Branca would later say that Michael asked him to come up with an agenda of ideas for the future, which seemed odd when a 5-year plan was already sketched out. Maybe that was my brother's way of testing his ex-attorney. Either way, Michael had had a game plan since 2008, regardless of what he did or didn't tell John in their 7 days of reacquaintance. When Frank DeLeo showed up, the people Michael had trusted at rehearsals were nudged out and blind to his schedule, because Frank treated everyone on a need-to-know basis. This was no doubt a protective measure in Frank's mind, but it bred a feeling of unease in others that Michael seemed to be under the command of someone who couldn't read him, his habits, or his nuances. To illustrate how little Frank knew about the modern-day Michael, he suggested my brother's moans about the tour going from 10 to 50 dates weren't relevant because he'd had the contract read to him and knew what was in it. But by mid-June, there seemed to be bigger concerns than clauses in contracts, because Michael's health inexplicably started to deteriorate. It all seems to have begun when Michael missed rehearsals on June 13th, 14th, and 15th. Even on the days when he did show, there were occasions when he'd turn up at 8 p.m. for a 2 p.m. start, as if just getting out of the house was a struggle. This coincided with the time when, instead of there being 2 guards around Michael, his security became 10 strong, and no one seems to know why. I don't know if it was at Michael's request or his security, but someone was clearly worried about something to bump up the numbers in this way. It was when Michael was at the Forum on June 17th that someone mentioned a noticeable deterioration in his appearance when he took to the stage. "That's not Michael up there. He's like a ghost. You see how skinny he's getting?" During the week that followed, further worrying signs stacked up for those who knew how on point and articulate he normally was. In the routine for Thriller, he turned left when he knew he had to turn right. That was odd in itself, but then he did it a second time. He also started repeating himself, a sentence or a phrase, like someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder. But he didn't have OCD. He struggled to finish one song, and he sometimes needed a teleprompter for lyrics. Plus, he had to be helped up and down ramps and flights of stairs. This weakness was also apparent in the Thriller routine, when he was supposed to come out from underneath a giant bug, which was made feather light for him to lift, but he couldn't push it up without assistance. His inner circle started to worry that something was wrong, because his behavior was so disturbingly out of character. In fairness to AEG, maybe its people didn't observe the same signs as those with a closer proximity, but even if that was the case, people would still sound the alarm bells to those in authority to actually do something to help. Meanwhile, at home, different observations were made. Paris remembers Daddy was always cold and always slept in front of the fireplace. I know that makeup artist Karen Fay, who knew my brother better than anyone, noticed how cold he was in rehearsals. Even Michael must have worried, because he called a nurse from home, complaining one half of his body was hot, the other cold. It is interesting that he sought the advice of a nurse, not Dr. Murray. Why would he reach out to a nurse instead of his personal physician? It doesn't make sense to me. The nurse told Michael to go to a hospital. For whatever reason, he chose not to. Meanwhile, back at rehearsals, it was clear that somewhere along the line, patience was running thin with Michael's absences and lateness. This is where I suspect, based on what I've heard from people who were there, that AG's people believed Michael's condition was related to the drug dependency they had presumably read about and believed. I can think of no other reason for the collective blindness that followed. Certainly, no one was giving Michael the kid glove treatment. Instead, I know that he felt belittled on several occasions, and he was also yelled at, as witnessed by people who were there. On one occasion, he deliberately spoke into his mic as he walked off stage. "I just want someone to be nice to me today." A voice from the floor yelled back, "If we could just have a coherent person here today." "They wouldn't speak to me like that if Joseph was here," Michael muttered, off mic. At times, Michael hated the way he was spoken to. Whatever assumptions people made about the reasons for his condition, how could anyone have missed his plummeting weight? I know the people around him voiced real concern about his weight, vocally and in writing. On one occasion, when someone expressed worry that he wasn't eating enough, they were told, out of Michael's earshot, "Just get him a bucket of chicken." The thinner Michael became, the colder he got. He began shivering on stage. He was given a thick coat to wear. In fact, he ended up wearing 3 layers of clothing to keep warm while rehearsing in a place where everyone else was baking. Presumably, this was why Kenny Ortega noticed he was chilled on June 19th. Chilled was his choice of word. But I've been given an alternative description by someone else who was there. Michael wasn't chilled. He was like a block of ice to touch. That was when someone, without any AEG authorization, placed a discreet call to a doctor whom Michael had consulted in the past. After the symptoms had been explained to him, the doctor said it sounded as if Michael was suffering from toxic poisoning of the brain and should get to a hospital. AEG could never have known about this call, but for reasons that remain maddening to me, he didn't go. It is clear to me that something was very wrong. Even taking into account the belief of some people at rehearsals that Michael had a prescription drug dependency, the suspected neurological symptoms, the frighteningly low body temperature, and drastic loss of weight, which he had never before displayed, don't line up with the theory of a prescription drug dependency. Not that Dr. Murray was giving AEG any sense that there was an emergency. Instead, after Michael was sent home on June 19th, he sent them a fax saying that Michael needed to rest for 2 days and would return once rehearsals had moved from the Forum to the Staples Center. Some around my brother also said he tried to put on a brave front for AEG and could appear as sharp as a tack on occasions in that final week. As one person put it, Michael didn't want anyone to think anything was wrong. But it's still hard for me not to worry and wonder in light of his suspicious death. I have lain awake at night wondering what was making him so ill. Was his doctor giving him so much anesthetic that it was slowly poisoning his system? Could my brother have known how much propofol was being injected into him? Whatever was happening to him, those closest to Michael at rehearsals, Karen Faye in makeup, and Michael Bush and Dennis Thompson in wardrobe, were seen to be frantic with worry, pleading for someone in authority to intervene. It was obvious that something was seriously wrong when, in that final week while still at the Forum, Michael was seen being taken out of the building, his arms draped around the shoulders of 2 bodyguards, looking like someone who had either collapsed or was too weak to stand. That was on an afternoon when Travis Payne stepped into Michael's shoes to do the run-through. But still, to the best of my knowledge, no one thought to get my brother urgent medical attention. Presumably they were relying on Dr. Murray. Had anyone reached out to us, Michael's family, we would have got him to hospital. It is hard for me to accept that no one called us. But for me, the responsibility to act was AEG's, because I cannot escape the strongest sense that it owed him a duty of care and that his welfare lay squarely with AEG. I know that most people, and the LAPD investigation, have so far focused on the fatal events of June 25th. But the disturbing incidents and symptoms in the days prior suggest that something was seriously wrong long before that. And yet, rehearsals would carry on regardless and switch to the Staples Center in downtown LA. If anything, instead of easing up on Michael, the pressure would now increase. As someone involved with AEG told me after witnessing everything backstage, Michael was this great bird with 2 broken wings standing near the edge of a cliff. And they kept pushing him and pushing him and pushing him, expecting him to fly and soar. But he would fall. The more I hear about those final rehearsals, the clearer it seems there was a focus on getting to London and hitting that target of 50 concert dates. Somewhere in the pressure that everyone felt, AEG viewed the King of Pop as a performing robot and lost sight of the human being. Out of anybody, the director Kenny Ortega was seen at rehearsals doing what he could to help. Once sending Michael home to rest, asking on camera if there was anything anyone could do for him. He also ensured Michael ate something by cutting up his chicken and feeding him, and he even gave him a foot massage. It was clear that Kenny felt Michael needed to eat. But I believe AEG should have gone further, because it seemed blindingly obvious to anyone that this tour had to be, needed to be, should have been cancelled. Because my brother was in no fit state to continue. Instead, there seemed to be an attitude of, the show must go on, as different AEG delegations were sent to Michael's home on June 18th and 20th to discuss his no-shows for rehearsals. The purpose of those summits was not to offer tea and sympathy, but to have, quote, strong words with Michael, and remind him of his contractual obligations. It was in one of those meetings that he was read the riot act, Michael's words. And, based on conversations he shared afterwards, he was left in no doubt that if he didn't step up and start delivering, they would not only pull the plug, but he was in danger of losing everything. This was, apparently, the tough love my brother needed if the concert was to meet his obligations. Tough love was the expression some people used when referring to how Michael should be handled. I guess the definition of losing everything included his prized music catalogue. His contract with AEG stated that if he failed to perform, he would be liable for all production costs and lost revenue, meaning his assets, and most notably, his Sony ATV catalogue, were collateral up for the taking. In this scenario, with Michael's 50% share going to AEG by default, Sony would have found itself with an undesirable partner, and would no doubt have tried to exercise the option rights it had taken out. If Michael failed, or was finished, he would have lost his precious catalogue. Whatever he was told during this meeting of June 18th, it was enough to make him show up for rehearsal at 9:30 p.m. I doubt he was well enough to rehearse, but he wanted to show willingness. He did nothing but watch a pyrotechnic show and discuss certain concepts, staying until 2 a.m. That was typical of Michael, not wanting to let anyone down, not wanting to be perceived as a failure, not speaking up for himself when he had clearly felt cajoled into attending. As one person there told me, he tried his best to fulfill his obligations, especially when he felt there would now be consequences if he didn't step up. Meanwhile, loyal fans who followed him everywhere had started to notice his deterioration, based on the briefest of meetings outside the rehearsal space. As one fan said in an email to Karen Fay, "I think there is something wrong with Michael's health. I think he is at the point where something bad and regrettable could happen to him. Please help him." What the fans couldn't know was that people like Karen did not just speak up. They were heard forcibly pleading for something to be done. I know that someone went to Kenny Ortega and Frank DeLeo and asked for a doctor and a psychologist to be brought in. This person was assured everything was under control. On the final rehearsal day at the Forum, on Saturday, June 20th, Kenny Ortega clearly did see something that concerned him when he visited Michael at home, because 1 hour after he left, choreographer Travis Payne received a phone call from Kenny telling him to urgently get to the house, leaving his assistant in charge to do the run-through that day. Whatever happened, and whatever was witnessed, are known only to those who were present. But that same afternoon, the musical director Michael Bearden made a bizarre announcement to dancers and crew on stage, telling them, "Everyone needs to pray for Michael and send him good wishes." This was 4 days before Michael died. Why would he say such a thing? And why, if we're at the point of prayers and good wishes, would the tour continue? Yet, the show apparently had to go on. And then, again bizarrely, everything changed on the final 2 days of rehearsals, the 23rd and 24th. Michael suddenly showed up at the Staples Center, looking upbeat, sharp, and reinvigorated. It was this version of my brother that the world saw during the This Is It movie, because it was those last 2 days that were filmed and captured mainly as the best rehearsal footage. The temporary 2-day truth for the box office, not the horrible truth of the preceding weeks. Not that this sudden transformation was good enough for AEG. Instead, it kept up its pressure, posting a man in a suit inside Michael's dressing room on June 24th. I cannot imagine how invasive this must have been, on what would be the last full day of his life. Presumably, Randy Phillips wanted someone to keep an eye on Michael, and maybe this was in the interests of his welfare, but Michael clearly detested this measure. He resorted to holding discussions in the bathroom, away from the stranger posted to monitor him. That last night of his life, rehearsals ran late, because Michael was preoccupied in the video world section, where he signed off on the visuals and computer images that would come up on the big screen behind him during concerts. Meanwhile, a whole bunch of men in suits turned up that night to watch the rehearsal. It seemed an odd formality to those who were there, but presumably these were corporate clients who were AEG related, coming to provide some kind of assessment which would have added further pressure on Michael. Once Michael was finished in the video world, he went to his dressing room and got prepared for a full dress rehearsal, which he carried out without a hitch, it seems, before he left the Staples Center at just after midnight on June 25th. One of the last people to speak with him that evening said, "Michael left looking forward to tomorrow. Apart from his obvious weight loss, there was no obvious sign of anything wrong in those final 2 days, and that was something his management, AEG, and his inner circle would all agree on." Michael told people he'd be in the next day to work on his vocals, the last thing he needed to tie up before the show was ready for London and the tour's new start date, July 13th. By then, he should have signed, sealed and delivered on his dream home in Vegas. I understand from people at rehearsals that after leaving the Staples Center, he was due to visit Tomi Tomi to sign the papers. Tomi Tomi was, apparently, holding the $15 million down payment in a safe. I don't know whether Michael went there as intended or simply straight home, but it might explain why his ex-manager was at the hospital the next day. It shows that Michael's eyes were firmly on his future, should anyone suggest he was tempted to commit suicide. When Michael got home, he struggled to sleep, with Dr. Murray by his side. Within the next 12 hours, he would be dead. He was found on the left side of the bed, where Dr. Murray says he tried to carry out CPR. On the floor, near one of the bed's feet, there was a tube of toothpaste and a string of wooden beads. His laptop and a pair of glasses were on the bedside table. There was also a urine sample in the room. Next to the bed, a tan sofa was, apparently, Dr. Murray's seat. One fact that has been established from preliminary hearings is that Dr. Murray used his iPhone a lot through the early hours of that fateful day. One call was to a woman he'd recently met, logged at 11:51 a.m., some 15 minutes before my brother apparently stopped breathing. She said she was talking to him when she realized he wasn't listening anymore, but the line was still open, and she heard a commotion. I heard coughing and mumbling, and she did not believe the coughing came from a doctor friend. She tried calling and texting him back, but received no reply. The circumstances of Michael's death were rough enough without us learning about events in the run-up to June 25th. With finding it impossible to accept Michael's inexplicable decline, and that one company didn't spot that something was seriously wrong. As for her family, and for peace of mind, we would like to know who else, if anyone, entered and left the house on the night of Michael's death. But, although the LAPD are treating his death as homicide, its investigators decided to retain only the 4 minutes of CCTV footage showing Dr. Conrad Murray's expected arrival. Unless the authorities surprise us, it seems all other footage has been erased. It is hard for us to understand why such crucial footage could be wiped like that. It makes me wonder if every stone has been turned in the LAPD's investigation. It is so far concentrated on one doctor and one night. I guess time will tell, but our only hope is that, ultimately, justice doesn't fail Michael, like everyone else seems to have done.
Like a sunset, dying with the rising